The flashbulbs popped like tiny firecrackers one after another, each burst of light sharp enough to sting the eyes. Cameras clicked in a steady rhythm, voices overlapped in practiced greetings, and laughter, bright, loud, and slightly too eager, filled the air like background music that never quite matched the mood. He stood near the edge of the room, a champagne flute in hand, nodding politely whenever someone caught his eye. His smile was there, the one the world expected, but it never quite reached the quiet place behind his eyes. Around him, the party pulsed with energy. Designers in bold outfits, producers swapping stories, actors leaning in close with exaggerated gestures. It was the kind of gathering people would later describe as electric, unforgettable, or the place to be. But for him, it felt like standing in a room full of noise with no door to step outside. He wasn't rude. He never walked away mid-conversation or rolled his eyes when someone asked the same question for the 10th time. But inside, he was already gone, retreating to a calmer space only he could access. It wasn't that he disliked people, quite the opposite. He cared deeply, often more than he let on. But crowds, especially ones wrapped in expectation and performance, drained something essential from him. It wasn't shyness, exactly. It was more like a mismatch between how the world wanted him to be and how he actually moved through life. He'd learned long ago that silence wasn't emptiness. It was a kind of listening, a way of holding space for things that couldn't be said out loud. This feeling hadn't started in Hollywood. It went back much further, to a childhood stitched together with goodbyes. His family had moved often, not out of choice, but necessity. Each new city meant new schools, new faces, new rules about how to act, how to speak, how to belong. He became good at watching, at reading the room before stepping into it. While other kids shouted their opinions or jostled for attention, he stayed quiet, observing how people connected, how they laughed, how they sometimes hurt each other without meaning to. He learned early that words could be weapons or bridges, and he didn't want to build either carelessly. There was also loss, deep, quiet losses that didn't come with fanfare but settled into the bones like winter chill. A father who left and never returned. A sister whose illness cast a long shadow over every happy moment. These weren't stories he told at parties. They weren't the kind of thing you brought up while someone was asking about your next movie or your favorite designer. So he kept them tucked away, not out of secrecy, but because some wounds don't heal in the spotlight. They heal in stillness, in the dark, in the company of someone who doesn't need you to explain why you're sad. You just are, and that's enough. Even as his career began to take shape, that instinct for quiet remained. While others celebrated a big audition with loud dinners and rounds of drinks, he'd slip away on his motorcycle, riding through empty streets just to feel the wind and the hum of the engine. It wasn't escape, it was recalibration. The bike didn't ask him to be charming or insightful. It just moved forward, and so did he. On set, he was known for being focused, kind, and present, but not chatty. He'd listen more than he spoke, and when he did speak, people noticed. Not because he raised his voice, but because his words carried weight. He didn't fill silence with noise. He let it breathe. This approach confused some people. In an industry that thrives on visibility, on being on at all times, his preference for low-key living seemed almost rebellious. Agents would gently suggest he attend more events, do more interviews, post more on social media. People want to know you, they'd say. But what they really meant was, people want a version of you they can package and sell. He understood the business side of it. He wasn't naive. But he also knew that if he started performing his personality the way he performed roles, he'd lose something irreplaceable himself. There was a moment, years ago, during the premiere of a film that would change everything, when he stood on the red carpet and felt completely invisible. Not because no one saw him, cameras were everywhere, but because no one saw him. They saw the character, the myth, the idea of who they thought he should be. That night, after the flashing lights faded and the crowd dispersed, he walked back to his hotel alone. No entourage, no after-party, just him, his thoughts, and the soft sound of his shoes on the pavement. And in that walk, he felt more real than he had all evening. It wasn't that he hated gatherings. He'd been to small dinners with close friends where laughter came easy and silence felt comfortable, not awkward. He'd shared quiet moments on film sets with crew members who'd worked with him for years. No need for small talk, just mutual respect and shared purpose. Those were the connections that fed him. But the big events, the ones where everyone was performing some version of themselves, those left him feeling hollow, like he'd spent hours smiling with his teeth but not his heart. Over time, he'd gotten better at navigating these spaces. He'd learned to give just enough smiles, enough handshakes, enough brief answers, to fulfill his obligations without disappearing completely. But it always came at a cost. After every public appearance, he needed recovery time. Not days off in the usual sense, but real solitude. Mornings with coffee and a book, afternoons fixing his bike, evenings walking through a park where no one knew his name. These weren't luxuries. They were necessities like sleep or water. Some called him mysterious. Others called him distant. A few even said he was arrogant, though those who knew him well would laugh at that. Arrogance implies a belief in your own superiority. What he carried wasn't arrogance, it was caution. A deep awareness that attention, especially the kind that comes with fame, can distort everything. It can turn kindness into strategy, silence into aloofness, and privacy into secrecy. He'd seen it happen to others. He'd watched talented people get chewed up by the machine, forced to become caricatures of themselves just to stay relevant. He didn't want that. So he drew lines, quietly, consistently, and stuck to them even when it meant missing out. And he had missed out. On friendships that might have deepened if he'd said yes to one more party. On opportunities that required a more visible presence. On the easy camaraderie that comes from shared late nights and inside jokes. But he'd also gained something rare. A sense of self that hadn't been shaped by applause or criticism. He knew who he was when no one was watching. And that, more than any award or headline, felt like a victory. Back at the party, someone tapped his shoulder. "You're so quiet tonight," they said with a smile that was more observation than judgment. He nodded, offered a small laugh, and said, "Just listening." And in that moment, it was true. He was listening, not to the chatter around him, but to the steady rhythm of his own breath, the quiet voice inside that had guided him through decades of noise. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes it felt lonely, but it was honest. And for him, that honesty was worth more than any spotlight. There was a person, just one, who never asked him to be anything other than exactly who he was. No expectations, no scripts, no need to fill the silence with chatter. They met years ago, on a film set that felt more like a summer camp than a workplace. Muddy boots, shared thermoses of coffee, and long days that ended with everyone too tired to pretend. At first they barely spoke, just nods in passing, the occasional, "You good?" exchanged while waiting for the next shot. But over time, something unspoken grew between them. Not friendship in the loud, performative way people usually think of it, but something quieter, deeper, like two trees whose roots have slowly tangled underground without anyone noticing. They didn't hang out at fancy restaurants or post pictures together. Instead, they'd meet on Sunday mornings at a nearly empty diner on the edge of town, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. They'd sit across from each other, sometimes talking for hours about everything: books, old movies, the strange beauty of broken things. Other times saying nothing at all, just sipping coffee while rain tapped against the window, and neither ever felt the need to apologize for the quiet. In fact, those silent moments often felt richer than any conversation. It was as if they both understood that presence didn't require performance. You could just be, and that was enough. This person had a way of seeing him, not the version the world projected onto him, not the actor or the icon, but the man underneath, with all his doubts and quiet joys and unspoken griefs. They never pushed for explanations when he fell silent. They didn't take it personally when he canceled plans because the weight of the world felt too heavy that day. Instead, they'd send a short text. No pressure. Just know I'm here, and that was it. No guilt, no drama, just a steady, unwavering offer of companionship on his terms. What made it even more rare was that this person didn't want anything from him. Not access, not stories for gossip, not even gratitude. They weren't interested in his fame or his connections. They liked him for the way he listened, for how he remembered small things, like how they took their tea or that they hated the sound of styrofoam being torn apart. They appreciated the way he showed up, not with grand gestures, but with consistency. A handwritten note after a rough week, a ride to the airport at dawn, or just sitting with them in the hospital waiting room when their dog needed surgery. Their bond thrived in simplicity. One winter, they spent an entire afternoon building a model train set in his garage, not because either of them cared much for trains, but because it gave them something to do with their hands while they talked about nothing important. Another time, they drove 6 hours to see a total solar eclipse, arriving just in time to watch the sky go dark in the middle of the day. They didn't take photos. They just stood side by side, watching the world hold its breath, and when it was over, they got back in the car and drove home in comfortable silence. He didn't realize how much he relied on this friendship until the day it ended. It wasn't dramatic or sudden in the way movies portray loss. There was no car crash, no final phone call. Just a slow fade, a few missed check-ins, a voicemail that went unanswered, then the quiet confirmation from someone else that they were gone. Illness had taken them quickly, quietly, the way they'd lived. And in the aftermath, he was left with a silence that felt different. Hollow, not peaceful. The grief didn't announce itself with tears or outbursts. It settled in like fog, wrapping around ordinary moments and making them unbearably heavy. He'd reach for his phone to share a funny observation, only to remember there was no one to send it to. He'd pass the diner and feel a sharp pang, not because he missed the coffee, but because he missed the feeling of being truly seen. And the worst part? There was no public way to mourn, no eulogy to give, no memorial to attend where he could stand and say, "This person mattered to me more than words can say." Their relationship had existed outside the spotlight, which meant its end also happened in the shadows. He tried to talk about it once to someone he thought might understand, but the words came out clumsy, inadequate. "We weren't close like, typical friends," he said, and instantly regretted it. Because they had been close, just not in a way that fit neatly into categories. Their closeness lived in the spaces between words, in shared glances and unspoken understandings. How do you explain that to someone who measures relationships by frequency of contact or social media tags? For weeks, he avoided the places they used to go. He stopped riding his motorcycle on their favorite route. He even skipped a film premiere he'd promised to attend, not out of disrespect, but because the idea of smiling for cameras while carrying this quiet ache felt impossible, and yet no one noticed. Or if they did, they assumed it was just another one of his mysterious disappearances. No one knew that inside. He was grieving a loss that felt as significant as any he'd ever experienced. What hurt most wasn't just the absence. It was the realization that so much of what they shared had never been voiced. He'd never said, "You helped me feel less alone." He'd never told them how much their quiet acceptance had given him permission to be himself in a world that demanded performance. He assumed there would be time. That's the cruel trick of deep, quiet bonds. They feel eternal because they're built on consistency, not spectacle. You don't think about saying the important things because you believe you'll always have another Sunday morning at the diner, another drive under a darkening sky. In the months that followed, he began to understand something new about silence. It wasn't always a refuge. Sometimes it was a barrier, even between people who loved each other. He'd protected his quiet so fiercely that he'd forgotten to let someone in fully, to say the things that matter before it's too late. That didn't mean he regretted his nature, but it did make him wonder, what if he'd risked a little more vulnerability? What if he'd said, "I need you," instead of just showing up quietly hoping they'd understand? He started writing letters, ones he'd never send, pages filled with things he wished he'd said, memories he wanted to honor, gratitude he'd held too close to his chest. It wasn't therapy in the clinical sense, but it was healing, and slowly he returned to the places they'd shared. He went back to the diner, ordered the same coffee, and sat in their booth for a while. It didn't bring them back, but it reminded him that love doesn't vanish just because someone is gone. It changes shape. It becomes memory, becomes lesson, becomes part of the quiet strength you carry forward. Years later, he'd still think of them when he saw a certain kind of light at dusk, or heard a song they used to hum absent-mindedly, and instead of pain, he'd feel a soft warmth, a reminder that some connections don't need crowds or declarations to be real. They just need two people willing to sit in silence together and find it enough. That friendship taught him that being known doesn't require noise. But it also taught him, too late, that sometimes you have to say the quiet part out loud, because the people who matter will listen, not with their ears but with their hearts. As his work reached more people, the expectations around him grew heavier, not in obvious ways, but in small, constant pressures that added up like drops filling a bucket until it overflowed. Everyone had an idea of how he should act, where he should show up, what he should say. Publicists gently reminded him that visibility matters. Studio heads hinted that his quiet nature made him hard to market. Even well-meaning fans would approach him with a mix of awe and confusion, as if they couldn't reconcile the calm person in front of them with the larger-than-life roles he played on screen. He never resented them for it. He understood that fame comes with a kind of contract. You give pieces of yourself to the public, and in return, your work finds its audience. But no one tells you how much of yourself you're expected to give, or what happens when you start to feel like there's nothing left to offer. There were real costs to staying true to his quiet nature. Not dramatic headline-grabbing losses, but quiet ones that accumulated over time like dust on a windowsill, barely noticeable at first, but eventually blocking the light. He began to notice the opportunities that slipped through his fingers, not because he wasn't talented or prepared, but because he wouldn't play the game the way it was expected to be played. One project in particular stayed with him. It was a film unlike anything he'd done before, raw, intimate, full of silence and space. The script moved him deeply. He could already see the scenes in his mind, feel the weight of the character's unspoken grief. He met with the director and they connected instantly. There was no pitch, no rehearsed enthusiasm, just two people talking honestly about storytelling and loss and the power of restraint. But then came the catch. The studio loved the idea, but only if he agreed to a full promotional tour. Talk shows in 3 countries, red carpets in 5 cities, photo shoots, interviews, fan events. It's the only way to get this kind of film scene, they said. He listened, nodded, and went home. For days he turned it over in his mind. He wanted to make the film. He believed in it. But the thought of months spent performing, smiling on cue, repeating the same answers, standing under hot lights while strangers dissected his every word, filled him with a deep, physical exhaustion. He knew himself well enough to know that if he said yes, he'd survive it, but he'd lose something essential in the process. The very quietness that made him right for the role would be drowned out by the noise required to sell it. In the end, he walked away. He sent a quiet note to the director, explaining as best he could without sounding ungrateful. The project went to someone else, someone brighter, louder, more willing to step into the spotlight without flinching. He didn't blame them. They were doing what worked for them just as he was doing what worked for him. But sometimes late at night he'd think about that film and wonder what it would have felt like to bring it to life. Not for the acclaim, but for the chance to tell a story that honored silence the way he understood it. Not as emptiness, but as a language of its own. Relationships outside of work suffered too. There was someone once, someone kind, thoughtful, with a laugh that felt like coming home. They spent months getting to know each other slowly, carefully, the way you'd handle something fragile. But over time, a distance grew, not from lack of care, but from mismatched rhythms. She wanted more words, more plans, more certainty. She'd ask, "What are we?" And he'd struggle to answer, not because he didn't know, but because the answer lived in actions, not labels. He showed up. He listened. He remembered the small things. But in her world, love needed to be spoken, declared, celebrated publicly. His quiet devotion felt like hesitation to her, and eventually she walked away, not angrily but sadly, saying, "I just need someone who can meet me halfway in the light." He understood. He really did. But he also knew he couldn't become someone he wasn't just to keep someone close. That wasn't fair to either of them. Still, the loss lingered. It made him question whether his way of being in the world was too much to ask of others. Was it selfish to choose silence when it cost him connection? Or was it honest to protect his inner world, even if it meant walking alone sometimes? Even within his own industry, his quietness was often misread. At award shows, when he didn't give flashy acceptance speeches, some called him disengaged. When he skipped after parties, rumors swirled that he was difficult or ungrateful. Few considered that maybe he was just tired of pretending, tired of being watched, tired of having his silence interpreted as something it wasn't. Once a journalist wrote that he hid behind mystery, as if his reserve was a calculated strategy rather than a natural state. He read the line and felt a familiar ache, not anger, but loneliness. How do you explain that you're not hiding, you're just being? And being quietly doesn't mean you're not present. He tried sometimes to bridge the gap. He'd force himself to attend an event, to stay a little longer, to offer a few more words than usual. But it always felt like wearing someone else's clothes, ill-fitting, uncomfortable, and ultimately inauthentic. and the more he tried to conform, the more he felt like a ghost in his own life, going through the motions without really living them. What made it harder was that the world rarely rewards quiet consistency. It celebrates boldness, volume, speed. People who speak loudly get heard first. People who post constantly get seen more. In a culture that equates visibility with value, choosing silence can feel like stepping out of the race entirely, and in many ways he had. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much about preserving the part of himself that couldn't survive in the glare. Still, he didn't regret his choices. Not truly. The cost was real, but so was the peace he'd gained. He'd rather miss an opportunity than betray his own rhythm. He'd rather lose a relationship than pretend to be someone he wasn't. These weren't proud stances. They were survival tactics, learned over years of trying to fit into spaces that weren't built for people like him. And yet, the question remained, whispering in quiet moments. What if I'd been just a little more willing to bend? Not to break, not to disappear, but to reach out a little more. Speak up a little sooner. Say the things he usually kept inside. Would things have turned out differently? He'd never know. All he had was the path he'd walked, marked by both loss and loyalty. To others, yes, but mostly to himself. In the end, the cost of his silence wasn't just what he missed. It was the constant negotiation between who he was and who the world wanted him to be. And every time he chose himself, it came with a price. But it also came with something deeper, the quiet certainty that he hadn't sold the most precious part of himself, the part that listened, that felt deeply, that found beauty in stillness. The rain started just as the car pulled up to the curb. Not a gentle drizzle, but a steady, soaking downpour that turned the city lights into smears of gold and red on the wet pavement. He stepped out without an umbrella, already resigned to getting soaked. The gala had run late. Another round of handshakes, another hour of smiling while his mind drifted somewhere far away. He'd done his part. Said the right things, stood in the right places, worn the suit they'd picked out. Now, all he wanted was to disappear into the night, to shed the skin of performance and just be a man walking home in the rain. He didn't call for a ride. He needed to move, to feel his body again after hours of standing still in a room full of eyes. So he started walking, collar turned up against the chill, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched slightly as if trying to make himself smaller. The streets were nearly empty this late, the usual bustle of the city softened by the rain. Puddles formed in the cracks of the sidewalk, and the sound of tires hissing on wet asphalt was the only music. It felt like the world had been rinsed clean, if only for a moment. After 20 minutes of walking with no real destination, he ducked into the first open doorway he saw, a small diner tucked between a laundromat and a closed bookstore. The bell above the door jingled softly, and warm air wrapped around him like a blanket. The place was almost empty, just a couple in a corner booth whispering over coffee, and a man in a work jacket reading a newspaper at the counter. The smell of grease, coffee, and old wood filled the air, familiar, comforting, real. A woman behind the counter looked up from wiping down the espresso machine. She was in her 50s maybe, with tired eyes and a calm face. She didn't gasp or grab her phone. She didn't even blink twice. She just nodded and said, "Rough night?" He almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was the first honest question he'd been asked all evening. "You could say that," he replied, shaking water from his sleeves. She gestured to a stool. "Sit. Coffee's on the house if you look as tired as you sound." He sat. The vinyl seat was cracked but clean. The counter was warm under his palms. She poured him a cup without asking how he took it. Black, she guessed, and set it down with a quiet clink. For a few minutes, neither spoke. He sipped the coffee, strong, bitter, perfect, and watched the rain streak down the window. Outside, the world kept spinning. Inside, time slowed. Then she leaned against the counter, arms crossed, not looking at him, just out the window. "You know," she said, voice low, "I used to think I had to be loud to be seen. Talk fast, laugh big, always have something to say. Thought that's what people wanted." She paused, wiped a spot on the counter that didn't need wiping. Took me 50 years to figure out that the people who matter don't need noise. They just need you to be real. He looked at her then, not as a fan, not as someone who wanted something, but as a person who'd lived, who'd learned, who understood. Something in his chest loosened. "I'm tired," he said, and the words surprised him. Not "I'm fine," or "It's been a long day." Just, "I'm tired." Not of work, not of the rain, but of pretending. She nodded like she'd been waiting for him to say it. "Maybe you don't have to," she said simply. Those 4 words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through everything he thought he knew. Maybe you don't have to. Not have to smile when he didn't feel like it. Not have to explain his silence. Not have to trade his peace for a seat at the table. The idea was so simple, so obvious, and yet it felt revolutionary. Because somewhere along the way, he'd started believing that his quietness was a problem to solve, a flaw to manage, a debt he owed the world for his success. But what if it wasn't? What if it was just him? Not a strategy, not a mystery, not a rejection, but a way of being that deserved respect, not correction. He sat with that thought as the coffee cooled in his hands. Outside, the rain eased to a mist. The couple in the booth left, leaving a generous tip and a quiet "good night." The man with the newspaper folded it neatly and walked out without a word. The diner grew quieter, cozier, like a secret the city had forgotten. He thought about all the times he'd apologized for his silence through actions if not words. Canceling plans last minute because he needed space. Leaving parties early. Avoiding interviews that felt too personal. He'd always carried a quiet guilt, as if his need for stillness was somehow selfish. But sitting there, in that ordinary place with an ordinary person who saw him without needing him to perform, he began to wonder, what if the real selfishness was expecting everyone to be the same? What if the world's demand for constant engagement was the problem, not his desire for peace? The woman refilled his cup without asking. "You ever notice," she said, "how the quietest people often carry the loudest hearts? They just don't shout about it." He smiled then, not the practiced one from the gala, but a real one, small and soft. "I never thought of it like that." They didn't talk much after that. Just sat in comfortable silence, 2 strangers sharing a moment that felt like understanding. When he finally stood to leave, she didn't ask for a photo or an autograph. She just said, "Take care of yourself. And don't forget, you don't owe anyone your noise." He walked out into the damp night, the words echoing in his mind. The city felt different now, not less bright, but less demanding. The lights didn't feel like spotlights anymore. The rain wasn't a nuisance, it was a gift, washing away the weight of expectation. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was failing at being who the world wanted. He just felt like himself, and that was enough. He didn't go straight home. He walked for another hour, letting the cool air clear his head. He passed a park where a lone street lamp lit a bench, and for a moment he considered sitting. But he kept moving, not running, not hiding, just walking, present in his own skin. And in that simple act, he felt something shift inside him. Not a dramatic change, but a quiet settling, like a door closing gently after being left ajar for years. He realized then that he didn't need to fix himself. He didn't need to become louder, more available, more engaging. He just needed to trust that the people who truly mattered would find him in the quiet and stay. The rest? They could keep their noise. He had his peace. And peace, he now understood, wasn't something you earned by pleasing everyone. It was something you claimed by honoring yourself, even if it meant walking alone in the rain, even if it meant saying no, even if it meant sitting in a nearly empty diner with a stranger who saw you clearer than anyone ever had. That night didn't solve everything. The pressures wouldn't vanish. The invitations would keep coming. The world would still expect him to perform. But something had changed inside him. A boundary had been drawn, not in anger but in clarity. He could show up when it mattered on his own terms. And when it didn't, he could walk away without guilt, without apology. As he finally turned onto his street, the sky began to lighten at the edges, just a hint of gray behind the clouds. Dawn was coming, and for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to meet it. Not as a character, not as a symbol, but as a man who had finally given himself permission to be exactly who he was. Quiet, yes, but whole. That part was still intact. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth more than everything he'd lost. Years passed, not with fanfare, but with the quiet rhythm of tides, steady, gentle, and deeply felt. The world kept spinning, louder and faster than ever, but he had learned to move through it without losing his center. He still got invitations, premieres, talk shows, charity galas with glittering guest lists, but now he answered them with a simple honesty that surprised even himself. If it felt right, he'd go. If it didn't, he'd say no. Not with guilt, not with elaborate excuses, just a quiet, "I won't be able to make it." And to his surprise, the sky didn't fall. People respected it more than he expected. Maybe because when he did show up, he was truly there. Not just his body, but his attention, his presence, his care. He'd stopped trying to explain his silence. He no longer felt the need to justify why he preferred a walk at dawn to a red carpet, or why he'd rather spend an evening fixing a friend's motorcycle than attending an industry party. Those choices weren't statements. They were just his life. And in that acceptance, something beautiful happened. The right people stayed. Not the ones who wanted a version of him they could show off, but the ones who loved him for the way he listened, the way he remembered small things, the way he showed up without needing to be seen. His work changed too, not in volume, but in intention. He turned down big, flashy roles that promised fame but felt hollow. Instead, he sought out stories that honored quiet strength, that gave space to grief, to healing, to the unspoken bonds between people. He worked with young filmmakers who didn't have big budgets but had big hearts. He showed up on indie sets not for the credit, but because he believed in the story, and because those sets often felt more like home than any studio lot ever had. No one asked him to be on, they just asked him to be real. And that he could do. Outside of acting, he poured his energy into things that mattered to him in ways no camera could capture. He quietly supported causes that helped people in the shadows, those struggling with illness, loss, or loneliness. He never posted about it. He didn't need the recognition. For him, kindness wasn't content. It was connection. He'd visit hospitals not as a celebrity, but as a person who remembered what it felt like to sit in a waiting room, heart pounding, hoping for good news. He'd send handwritten notes to strangers who'd written him letters about their own grief, not with advice, but with simple acknowledgement. "I see you. You're not alone." He also made peace with solitude. It wasn't loneliness anymore, it was companionship with himself. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, watching the light change over the hills. Evenings ended with a book, a notebook, or just sitting in the dark, listening to the hum of the world settling down. He wrote sometimes, not for anyone else, just to untangle his thoughts, to honor the quiet movements of his own heart. Those pages would never be published, and that was the point. They were his, and that made them sacred. He still missed the people he'd lost, the friend who understood his silence, the relationships that faded because his quietness felt like distance to others. But the grief had softened. It no longer felt like a wound. It felt like love that had nowhere else to go, and so he let it flow into how he lived, with more patience, more presence, more willingness to say the quiet things out loud when it mattered. One spring morning, he found himself on a nearly empty beach, just as the sun began to rise. The sand was cool under his bare feet, the air salty and still. He carried a small notebook and a pen, not because he planned to write anything important, but because he liked the feel of paper in his hands, the scratch of ink on a quiet page. He sat on a smooth rock near the water's edge and watched the horizon turn gold. There were no grand revelations that morning. No sudden epiphanies. Just peace, deep, unshakable peace. He thought about how far he'd come, not in fame or fortune, but in self-trust. He'd spent so much of his life wondering if his silence was a burden, a barrier, a flaw. Now he knew it was his compass. It had led him away from noise that drained him and toward connections that fed his soul. It had taught him to listen, not just to others, but to himself. He opened the notebook and wrote a single line. I don't need to be understood by everyone, just by the right ones. He closed it, smiled, and tucked it back into his pocket. The tide rolled in, then out, over and over like breath. He sat there for a long time, not thinking, not planning, just being. And in that stillness, he felt more alive than he ever had under the brightest spotlight. Later, as he walked back up the path, a young couple passed him holding hands, laughing softly about something only they understood. He nodded as they passed, and they nodded back. No recognition, no fuss, just two humans sharing a moment in the same world. And that was enough. Back home, he made tea and sat by the window. The day stretched ahead, full of nothing urgent and everything meaningful. Maybe he'd call an old friend just to hear their voice. Maybe he'd work on his motorcycle, the one he'd been rebuilding piece by piece for years. Maybe he'd read or take a nap or do absolutely nothing at all. The beauty was in the choice, in knowing he didn't owe his time or his energy to anyone but himself and the people he loved. He'd learned that silence wasn't a wall. It was a sanctuary. And within it he'd found everything he'd ever needed: clarity, peace, authenticity. The world might never fully understand why he preferred quiet over crowds, stillness over spectacle. But he didn't need it to, because the cost of his silence, the missed opportunities, the misunderstood intentions, the lonely nights, had been worth it. They'd led him here, to a life that felt true, not performed, and in the end, that was the greatest success of all, not being loved by millions, but being at peace with one, himself. The sun climbed higher, warming the room. He took a slow sip of tea, closed his eyes for just a moment, and let the quiet wrap around him like a well-worn coat. Outside the world buzzed on, but inside all was calm, and for the first time in a long time, maybe ever, he knew, without doubt, without apology, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. There was no grand finale, no final curtain call, just life continuing quietly and steadily, like a river that doesn't announce its depth. After everything, the noise, the loss, the slow reckoning with his own nature, he found himself not at an ending but in a kind of everyday grace. The kind that doesn't make headlines but fills the heart. He still got up most mornings before the sun, not out of habit but because those hours belonged only to him. No phones, no requests, no roles to play. Just the soft hum of the world waking up and the chance to meet it as himself. People sometimes assumed that choosing silence meant choosing isolation. But that wasn't true, not anymore. He'd learned that connection didn't require volume. It required presence, and he'd gotten better at offering that in his own way. He'd started saying "I care" more, not with speeches, but with actions. A phone call just to check in. A handwritten note slipped into a friend's mailbox. Showing up at a small art opening for someone he barely knew, just because they'd poured their soul into the work. These weren't grand gestures. They were quiet affirmations. I see you. You matter. He also began to notice how his choices rippled outward in ways he never expected. A young filmmaker once told him, years after they'd worked together on a tiny, nearly invisible project, that his calm presence on set had changed how they saw leadership. You didn't yell. You didn't demand attention. You just showed up and did the work with respect. That stayed with me. He hadn't known. He'd just been himself, but that was enough to plant a seed in someone else's life. He stopped measuring his worth by how many people knew his name or how loudly he was praised. Instead, he measured it by how often he felt at peace at the end of the day, by whether he'd been kind, by whether he'd stayed true to the quiet voice inside that had guided him through storms. Some days he got it right. Other days he stumbled, snapped at someone out of exhaustion, said yes when he meant no, let the noise of the world drown out his own rhythm. But he no longer punished himself for it. He'd learned that self-compassion was part of the journey too. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in his garage, he found a notebook from years ago, back when the weight of expectation felt heaviest. Flipping through the pages, he saw scribbled lines like, "Why can't I just be enough as I am? And what I'm so tired of pretending." Reading them now, he didn't feel sadness. He felt tenderness for the younger version of himself who was trying so hard to fit into a world that didn't understand him. He closed the book gently and placed it back in the box, not to bury it, but to honor it. That younger self had done the best he could, and he'd made it through. He also began to share his quiet wisdom, not in interviews or on stages, but in small human ways. When a neighbor's teenager looked lost and overwhelmed, he didn't offer advice. He just sat with them on the porch one evening and said, "It's okay to not have it all figured out. Most of us don't." When a crew member on a film set seemed anxious, he'd bring them a coffee and say, "Take your time. We've got you." These weren't lessons he taught, they were truths he lived, and sometimes that was enough to give someone else permission to breathe. He still avoided the spotlight when he could, but when he did step into it, he did so with intention, not to perform but to serve. If a cause mattered, if it could help someone feel less alone, less unseen, he'd lend his voice even if it felt uncomfortable. But he'd learn to set boundaries. He'd do one interview, not 10, one event, not a tour, and he'd walk away when it stopped feeling aligned. No guilt, no drama, just a quiet thank you but no, and the world surprisingly adapted. People began to respect his rhythm. They stopped expecting him to be loud. Some even started to appreciate the space he created, the way his silence invited others to slow down, to listen, to be real. He became less of a mystery and more of a mirror, showing people that it was possible to live with depth in a shallow world, to move with gentleness in a noisy one. He also reconnected with old joys he'd almost forgotten. Riding his motorcycle again, not for escape but for joy. The wind, the open road, the feeling of freedom that came from moving forward with nothing but your thoughts and the hum of the engine. He'd take long weekend rides into the mountains, staying in small cabins with no Wi-Fi, just books, a stove, and the sound of rain on the roof. Those trips weren't vacations. They were homecomings, to himself. In his relationships, he became more honest about his needs. Instead of disappearing when he felt overwhelmed, he'd say, "I need a little space to recharge. I'll be back soon." And to his surprise, people understood. Not all of them, but the right ones did. And that was enough. He'd rather have 3 people who truly got him than 300 who only liked the idea of him. He also made peace with the fact that some things would always remain unspoken. Not every feeling needed a label. Not every silence needed filling. He'd learned to trust that love could live in the spaces between words. In a shared glance, a hand on a shoulder, a quiet, "I'm here." That kind of love didn't need an audience. It just needed 2 people willing to be real. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching fireflies blink in the dusk, he realized something simple but profound. He was happy. Not the flashy, look at me kind of happiness, but the deep, quiet kind that comes from living in alignment with your truth. He didn't have everything. He never would. But he had enough. Enough peace. Enough connection. Enough moments of stillness that felt like grace. And in that realization, he understood the final lesson his silence had been trying to teach him all along. You don't have to earn the right to exist as you are. You already have it. The world may ask you to shrink or stretch or shout, but your worth isn't tied to how well you perform. It's tied to how faithfully you honor your own soul. So he kept choosing silence, not as a rejection of the world, but as a commitment to himself. And in that choice, he found something rare. A life that felt like his own. Not perfect, not easy, but true, and that, more than anything, was worth every cost.